They say you're a good person. You help your friends. You try not to lie, at least not about the things that really matter. You feel guilty when you hurt someone, and maybe you even try not to do it again. You're respectful, cooperative. Maybe you recycle. Maybe you donate to a cause. Maybe you take pride in being someone who wouldn't hurt a fly. But what if all of that is just a fragile illusion? What if your goodness isn't a reflection of who you are, but of the conditions around you? What if what you call morality is less a deep-rooted virtue and more a temporary kind of comfort? We like to believe that goodness is fixed, an inherent trait, a stamp of purity. We draw lines, the good on one side, the bad on the other. The villains live in headlines, in prison cells, in the darker pages of history. And us, we imagine ourselves among the righteous, the awake, the just. But there's a quieter, more uncomfortable truth, one most people avoid at all costs. Goodness isn't a fortress. It's a facade. And facades can crack. With time, with pain, with just the right kind of temptation. The line between good and evil doesn't separate people. It runs straight through every single human being. Even the best among us carry, in silence, seeds of darkness. They don't bloom right away. They're patient. They wait for the right circumstances. They wait for wounds. They wait for justifications. Carl Jung called this the shadow, everything we repress, deny, and hide from ourselves. Our anger, our envy, our hunger for control, our quiet urge to harm. Parts of ourselves we label unworthy, yet remain very much alive within the psyche. And the more we deny the shadow, the more power it holds over us. Most people walk through life with smiles on their lips and wars in their minds. We're trained to appear good, but who are we really when no one's watching? We live in a culture obsessed with appearances. We learn to act empathetic, to speak carefully, to maintain the image of morality. But somewhere inside, in a muffled, forgotten corner, there's a voice that whispers things we're not ready to admit. Maybe that doesn't make us bad. Maybe it just makes us human. The real danger isn't having a dark side. It's believing you don't have one at all. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo led the now infamous Stanford prison experiment. He selected 24 college students, emotionally stable, mentally balanced, and randomly assigned them roles. Half would be guards, the other half prisoners. Within less than a week, the results shocked the world. The students assigned to be guards began to humiliate, abuse, and degrade their peers with shocking speed. One of them later said, "I started acting sadistically. I was surprised by myself. I got so into the role I forgot who I was." These young men weren't monsters. They were ordinary people. Smart, friendly, the kind you'd run into at a coffee shop, a classroom, a checkout line. And yet, all it took was a few rules, a uniform, an invisible authority, and everything changed. What does this reveal? It shows that morality isn't as solid as we like to believe. That goodness is often a surface behavior, and under pressure the mask begins to slip. We all want to believe that, in extreme situations, we'd rise to the occasion. That in the face of injustice, we'd be the voice of reason. That we wouldn't stay silent, wouldn't comply, that we wouldn't betray our own conscience. But history tells a different story. When fear takes hold, when the command comes from above, when the group approves, when punishment looms, when language is twisted, even the righteous hesitate, and the hesitant sometimes give in. The most terrifying part isn't that good people can do bad things. It's that, when they do, many still believe they're doing the right thing, convinced they're serving a higher cause, something noble, something necessary. So the real question isn't who's good or who's evil. The real question is this: what happens to a good person when the world pushes them to the edge? And more than that, are we truly certain of our own goodness? Or have we simply never been tested? Maybe true virtue isn't about appearing good, but about recognizing the darkness within us and choosing every single day not to feed it. Because in the end, maybe evil isn't out there in the figures we condemn, but inside, in the silence we avoid. And maybe, just maybe, what makes someone truly dangerous isn't their capacity for evil, but their absolute certainty that they're incapable of it. There's a myth we carry from childhood, that evil is something external, a force that invades, possesses, corrupts, or tempts. We grow up believing that goodness is our default state, and that anything outside of that is a flaw, an influence, an accident. But what if that's not true? What if evil doesn't come from outside at all? What if it lives inside us, just waiting for the right conditions to grow? Carl Jung, perhaps one of the clearest minds of the 20th century, warned us, every human being carries a shadow within. Not a mystical metaphor but a psychological reality, the dark side of the personality shaped by everything the conscious mind refuses to accept. Anger, envy, jealousy, cruelty, resentment, the hunger for power. No matter how civilized, kind, or compassionate we believe ourselves to be, the shadow is there. The problem is we were never taught to recognize it. On the contrary, we were raised to hide it, to repress it, to pretend it doesn't exist. That's not like you, they said. Good boys don't get angry. Good girls don't scream. Little by little, we learn to silence entire parts of ourselves. But what silence doesn't vanish, it simply turns into poisonous quiet. The shadow doesn't need to be visible to operate. It moves in the margins. In the small decisions we make when no one's watching. In the sharp tone that slips out under stress. In the hidden pleasure we feel when someone else fails. It acts through moral rigidity. Through the unconscious desire to punish, to dominate, to feel superior. And perhaps most dangerously, it acts through projection, when we unload onto others everything we refuse to see in ourselves. Projection of the shadow is one of the most insidious mechanisms of the human mind. We can't bear to face our own darkness, so we begin to see it in those around us. In our neighbor, a coworker, the opposing political tribe. We become experts in spotting evil in others, while ignoring the mirror it offers us. So often, our outrage is nothing more than a defense. A shield against the parts of ourselves we're too afraid to confront. And the more we deny our shadow, the more vulnerable we become to it. Because what we refuse to see, we cannot control. What we repress, eventually erupts. History is filled with men and women who, in the name of order, justice, or morality, committed atrocities, convinced they were doing good. They didn't see themselves as evil, only as firm, necessary, right? Jung once wrote, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The real danger then isn't the existence of the shadow, but the refusal to face it. And when it's not acknowledged, it takes over. Quietly. Without fanfare. The shadow doesn't need to shout. It feeds on our silence. In a world obsessed with appearing virtuous, where image is valued more than integrity, the shadow finds the perfect environment to grow. And it wears disguises. Justice, purity, moral outrage. There's something deeply ironic and tragic about the fact that many of history's greatest acts of violence were committed by people who saw themselves as saviors, as defenders of the good. But the evil committed in the name of good is perhaps the hardest to recognize, and therefore the most dangerous of all. That's why the first step to not becoming what we condemn is simple, but brutal: to admit that we are capable of it. That evil isn't an aberration but a possibility. That we're not good by nature, we're good only as far as life allows us to be. Maybe you've never yelled at someone just for the thrill of it. Maybe you've never secretly wished for a friend to fail. Maybe you've never manipulated, humiliated, or silenced someone to feel superior. But are you sure, not even for a second, those thoughts never crossed your mind? Because that second is where the danger lives. Where there's thought, there's potential. And where there's potential, there's responsibility. Acknowledging the shadow isn't weakness. It's courage. It's admitting that we are ambiguous, complex, contradictory. That we can love and hurt, heal and destroy. That inside each of us lives both the seed of goodness and the poison of harm. And ultimately, we are the ones who choose what we water. Maybe it's time to let go of the comforting illusion of purity. Because as long as we believe evil always lives in someone else, it will continue to grow inside us. Evil doesn't always arrive with a cruel face. It doesn't always scream or threaten. Often it wears a uniform, speaks softly, hides behind orders. It smells like normalcy. It sounds like procedure, duty, protocol. Evil, at its most dangerous, doesn't come as monstrosity. It comes as routine. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that shook the world's faith in human goodness. The premise was deceptively simple. Test how far an ordinary person would go in obeying authority, even if it meant inflicting pain on another human being. The outcome? A disturbing number of participants, with no signs of cruelty or malice, delivered what they believed to be lethal electric shocks to strangers, merely because a man in a white lab coat told them, "Please continue." They hesitated. They sweated. They trembled. But they obeyed. And perhaps the most unsettling part? Many of them later said they were just following orders. That they weren't responsible. That they trusted the authority figure. This is evil's most fertile soil: obedience without reflection. Morality outsourced. Conscience lulled to sleep in the name of a greater structure. The moment we stop asking, "Is this right?" and instead ask only, "Is this allowed?" something within us bends. And once bent, we begin to accept almost anything. Obedience is comfortable. It frees us from the burden of choice, of doubt, of guilt. All we have to do is follow the script, press the right buttons, put on the uniform, recite the lines. It's no wonder that totalitarian regimes, dehumanized corporations, and abusive institutions thrive on rigid hierarchies. They don't need monsters. They just need efficient employees. Years later, in reflecting on the infamous Stanford prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo would conclude that evil doesn't require sadism. It only needs a setting, a role to play, a rationale that dissolves personal responsibility. And this strikes a deep chord within us because we live in a world that is increasingly specialized, fragmented, compartmentalized. No one feels fully responsible for anything anymore. I just wrote the code. I just made the delivery. I just follow the rules. The chain is long, and in every link of obedience, there's a human being who stopped thinking. Nazism wasn't built solely by psychopaths. It was carried out by drivers, accountants, secretaries, soldiers, neighbors. Ordinary people who, when faced with a moral choice, said yes when they needed to say no. Who chose order over ethics, duty over doubt, blind loyalty over moral clarity. And before we point fingers with arrogant distance, it's worth looking around, and within. How many times have you done something you knew was wrong, but justified it with, "I had no choice"? How many times did you stay silent in the face of injustice just to protect your position, your name, your peace of mind? How many times did you tell yourself it wasn't your problem? Modern evil is sophisticated. It doesn't scream. It doesn't bleed. It sits in boardrooms, hides behind targets, shields itself with policies. It thrives in the silence of bystanders, in the hands of those who follow orders, in the words, "There's nothing I can do." Modern evil is bureaucratic. And that's exactly what makes it so efficient. Obedience in itself isn't evil. But when it becomes an end in itself, when we shut off our critical thinking in the name of hierarchy, when we trade empathy for a job description, it becomes the perfect channel through which darkness flows. And there's something even more unsettling, the pleasure some people feel in obedience. Because orders absolve us of responsibility. And where responsibility disappears, the worst can find room to grow. Deep down, many prefer order to freedom. Because freedom demands courage. To think, to choose, to bear the weight of consequences, that's hard. Order doesn't ask that of us. It gives us a place, an excuse, a moral shield. But without inner freedom, obedience becomes cowardice. And cowardice, dressed up as duty, commits atrocities in the name of discipline. Maybe the true test of character isn't what we do when we're in control, but what we do when someone else is. Maybe the most urgent question isn't, "Are you a good person?" but rather, "Would you say no if the whole world said yes?" Because if evil can wear the mask of duty, then resistance requires more than values. It requires presence, awareness, clarity. And above all, it requires the courage to disobey. Before anyone can be harmed, they must first be unseen. This is one of the darkest and quietest truths of the human condition. No cruelty on a grand scale has ever happened without first stripping the other of their humanity. The story of evil doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with the denial of someone else's personhood. Dehumanization is a slow, insidious, almost invisible process. It doesn't just happen in wars and genocides. It happens in jokes, in sweeping generalizations, in stereotypes repeated until they sound like truth. It happens in the glance that looks past, the words that reduce, the gestures that silence. It happens every time we turn people into categories, them, those people, his kind. When Hannah Arendt observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Nazi logistics machine, she coined the term, the banality of evil. Not to downplay its horror but to expose its ordinary face. Eichmann didn't look like a monster. He was mediocre, methodical, obedient. And yet, he was responsible for coordinating the transports that led millions to their deaths. How does someone like that sleep at night? The answer is simple and brutal. He didn't see people. He saw numbers, cargo, statistics, elements. When the other is no longer human, any violence becomes possible. Because we don't feel empathy for what we no longer recognize as a mirror. We don't feel guilt for harming what we've already labeled as lesser. And we don't hesitate to erase what we've decided has no face. This logic repeats itself, on battlefields, in refugee camps, down school hallways, inside online forums. Wherever there is hatred, there was first dehumanization. And wherever there is dehumanization, there is permission. A quiet, implicit permission to act without remorse. Bullying, for instance, rarely begins with sheer malice. It begins with shared laughter, with the normalization of exclusion, with a glance that fails to see the other as an equal. The internet, then, has become the perfect laboratory for this. Behind screens, faces disappear. Stories vanish. What's left are avatars, hot takes, those people on the other side. It's easy to attack someone when that someone is just a thumbnail on your feed. But this goes far beyond the digital world. Dehumanization is what allows racism to persist. What lets homophobia disguise itself as humor. What makes it possible for someone to see homeless people as a problem rather than as people. It's what enables us to say serves them right when someone we dislike suffers, because at some level we've already stopped seeing them as human. There's a dangerous illusion in today's culture that bad people are the ones who hate. But hate is just the symptom. What feeds it is moral distance. The belief that the other doesn't feel as you feel, doesn't suffer like you suffer, doesn't deserve what you deserve. Hatred isn't the beginning, it's the outcome of a psychological, social, and emotional process that slowly erases the other's face. And what makes us so vulnerable to that process? Fear. Fear of the unfamiliar, the strange, the person who threatens our worldview. Fear fuels division. And when we're divided, we build walls. And behind those walls, we forget there are people. Dehumanization doesn't need monsters. It only needs the absence of contact, emotional distance, the comfort of staying among our own. It thrives in polarization and tribal thinking, in the certainty that we are right, and they are wrong. It turns disagreement into a moral crusade, where the other is not just someone with a different view, but someone who is lesser, dangerous, disposable. And from there, any violence can be justified. Because morality, when wielded as a weapon, doesn't protect. It destroys. Maybe then the real antidote to cruelty isn't just empathy, but the relentless effort to see the human, even where we'd rather not. Even on the other side. Even in the aggressor. Even in the one who hurt us. It's hard. It goes against instinct. Against the culture of quick responses and instant judgment. But it's necessary. Because every time you strip someone of their humanity, you strip a little of your own. And if there's no humanity left in the other, soon there won't be any left in us. Not all cruelty is born of hatred. More often it grows from pain. Behind many violent acts, there are untreated wounds. Behind harsh words, there are even harsher inner voices. Behind anger that explodes, there's often an old abandonment, a buried humiliation, an unseen emptiness. Gabor Mate, physician and thinker in contemporary psychology, puts it bluntly, hurt people hurt people. That's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And perhaps, a call to lucid compassion, to a deeper understanding that all behavior has roots, and that sometimes evil is a symptom. Trauma isn't what happens to us. It's what happens inside us as a result of what we lived through. A slap can hurt less than silence. A scream can heal faster than abandonment. What defines trauma isn't the event, it's the psychic loneliness that follows it. The child who cries and isn't comforted. The teenager who suffers and is mocked. The adult who reaches out and is ignored. These wounds accumulate. They sink beneath the surface like landmines waiting to explode. And when they find no space to be heard, they turn into armor. Cynicism. Control. Aggression. Cruelty, more often than not, is the most primitive way to avoid feeling one's own pain. That's why so many tyrants were once humiliated children. That's why so many violent men were once little boys taught that crying was weakness. That's why so many cold women were once girls who had to be strong far too soon. Trauma steals our tenderness. It teaches us to distrust affection. And most of all, it convinces us that hurting others is the only way to avoid being hurt. It's a quiet chain. Those who weren't loved enough often don't learn how to love. Those who were treated with brutality often confuse harshness with respect. And those who grew up without comfort often become unable to offer it. In this way, pain replicates itself, like an echo carried across generations. No one is born cruel. Cruelty is learned when pain has no safe way out. But trauma doesn't just live in the past. It shapes perception. It amplifies threats. It lowers tolerance. It creates disproportionate reactions. Someone gives you a sideways glance, and suddenly you feel the same rage you once felt toward an authoritarian father. Someone disagrees with you, and without realizing it, you feel your very existence is under attack. The present becomes a trigger, and the past an invisible prison. We live in a traumatized society, and, paradoxically, one that stays silent about trauma. We reward performance, not healing. The appearance of strength, not vulnerability. But what's repressed doesn't disappear, it distorts. And the most unsettling part, trauma often wears the mask of morality. Someone deeply wounded may cling to ideologies, doctrines, rigid narratives, anything to keep from sinking into their own inner chaos. And in the name of those ideas they become merciless. The resentful become crusaders. The rejected turn into censors. The invisible become inquisitors. It's not hard to find, behind intolerance, a biography of pain. That doesn't mean everything is excusable. Pain doesn't give anyone a free pass to harm. But maybe instead of only asking what did this person do, we should also ask, what happened to them? Not to absolve, but to understand. Because without understanding, there can be no transformation. And without transformation, pain just keeps echoing, within us and around us. When we ignore our own trauma, we become its slaves. But when we face it, honestly, bravely, something begins to shift. We start to see in others not enemies but possible mirrors. Healing isn't fast, and it's not neat. It requires walking through the rubble of the soul, listening to what hurts, accepting what we were once forced to deny. But it's in that very process that the cycle breaks. The chain loosens. And for the first time, something inside us begins to breathe. In the end, cruelty might be the scream of someone who was never truly heard. And maybe, just maybe, real kindness begins when we choose to listen. Especially to what we most want to avoid feeling. Few things are as dangerous as someone absolutely convinced of their own righteousness. Because those who believe themselves pure never stop to question themselves. And those who never question themselves can't see their own excesses. Moral conviction, when blind, can be more lethal than outright malice, because it refuses to acknowledge its own limits or admit its contradictions. Nietzsche, in his brutal clarity, warned us long ago, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." And he added, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." It's a warning against moral arrogance, against the hidden pleasure of believing you're on the right side of history. Because within that pleasure often lies the seed of cruelty in disguise. We live in a time when many don't want to be just, they want to be morally superior. And this hunger for superiority hides behind noble causes. Justice, inclusion, progress, patriotism, faith. But behind many of these banners, what often lurks is the same old thirst for power, dressed up as virtue. The internet makes this painfully clear. People are cancelled, shamed, and mocked, not because they're monsters but because they failed to meet some impossibly pure moral standard. The crowd doesn't gather to understand, but to punish. Not to heal but to destroy. In this context, hate doesn't come from those who think they're evil, but from those who believe they're better. This is where goodness becomes theater. A stage for rehearsed virtue, selective empathy, performative outrage. It's not justice people are after, but applause. Not truth but positioning. Nietzsche called this the morality of the weak. A moral stance that doesn't arise from inner strength but from resentment. The weak, unable to affirm their own will, strike where they can, masked as the righteous. They don't truly want good, they want to see others fall so they can feel lifted. Their virtue is a shield for their envy. Their kindness, a disguise for their rage. This morality of resentment is everywhere. It lives in the fiery speeches of those who speak in the name of justice, but act with cruelty. It hides in those who see themselves as eternal victims, and believe that gives them the right to punish. It fuels the groups that divide the world into the pure and the impure, the good and the evil, and justify anything because they believe they're fighting for the right cause. But history is full of tragedies committed by people who thought they were doing good. The inquisitors burned bodies in the name of salvation. The colonizers claimed to bring civilization to the very people they enslaved. Totalitarian regimes promised a more just society by eliminating their internal enemies. There's always a noble cause. There's always a justification. And there's always an enemy who must be destroyed for the greater good. Authentic goodness is quiet. It has nothing to prove. It doesn't perform. It doesn't seek reward. It acts even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Because it doesn't come from vanity. It comes from conscience. It's not built on a stage but within by those who dare to look at themselves with radical honesty. Performative goodness, on the other hand, is fragile. It feeds on validation, on moral status. And when it's questioned, it lashes out. Because behind the mask of virtue, there's often an inflated ego, and an ego that believes itself holy is far more dangerous than one that knows it's flawed. To be good is not to see yourself as good. It's to recognize the harm you're capable of, and still choose not to cause it. It's to resist the temptation to place yourself above others, to question your own righteousness, to know that under the right conditions, you too could falter, misjudge, wound, repeat what you once condemned. True goodness is humble, because it knows it's never guaranteed. And precisely because of that, it doesn't need to humiliate anyone to exist. And now, after everything, one question lingers, burning like a mirror held too close. What do we do with our shadow? Do we deny it? Repress it? Bury it in some dark corner of the soul and pretend it's not there? Or perhaps, do we feed it in secret, with small compromises, while keeping the polished surface of public virtue intact? Maybe the answer is neither repression nor surrender. Maybe the path lies in something far more difficult and far more honest: integration. Carl Jung insisted, it's not about eliminating the shadow but about knowing it, naming it, giving it a face, a place within conscious awareness. Because what we refuse to see ends up ruling us, and what we finally recognize begins to lose its power. The shadow doesn't vanish through denial. It hides, it waits, and it returns stronger, subtler, crueler. When we pretend we're incapable of harming, that's precisely when we harm most easily. When we believe ourselves above evil, that's when we become dangerous. Because the unacknowledged shadow gets projected. And what we project, we fight. And what we fight without understanding, we inevitably repeat. But there is another way. A harder path, a braver one, and maybe the only truly human one. To look within. To see ourselves whole. To admit, without disguise, that there are parts of us that want to control, to manipulate, to humiliate. That there are moments when another's suffering brings us a shameful satisfaction. That there are corners of our being that feed on resentment, on comparison, on the illusion of superiority. To see this is not weakness. It is freedom. Because consciousness is the only antidote to the soul's autopilot. True redemption doesn't come from denying the shadow, but from integrating it. That doesn't mean giving in to its urges. It means listening. Understanding where it comes from. What it's trying to protect. What pain it's hiding. What untold story pulses beneath its surface. Often, the shadow is a wounded child dressed as a beast. It screams, lashes out, defends itself, because it doesn't know any other way to exist. When we listen, it softens. When we ignore it, it arms itself. When we understand it, it begins to transform. Redemption, then, isn't some angelic state. It's an ongoing process. A daily choice. It's the acceptance that we are contradictory, complex, ambiguous, and still capable of meaning, compassion, and clarity. It takes work. Inner work. Quiet work. The kind no one sees. Because it's not about seeming good. It's about becoming whole. It's about knowing we're capable of hate and still choosing not to act in hatred. That we're capable of judgment and still choosing to listen. That we're capable of harm and still choosing to hold space. And above all, it's knowing that we are not finished. We never will be. The human being is not a completed project. It's a crossing. So when we return to the question that started it all, how do good people become cruel? Maybe we can answer it with more honesty. Good people become cruel when they forget they're also dangerous. When they believe they're beyond falling. When they drift so far from their own darkness, they no longer recognize its face. The shadow isn't what makes us less human. Paradoxically, it's what reminds us that we still are. Maybe, in the end, evil doesn't live only in those who choose to harm, but also in those who refuse to look within. And maybe goodness, the real kind, isn't about appearing full of light, but about carrying our own darkness with humility, without letting it lead the way. Because clarity doesn't come from purity. It comes from confrontation, from facing all that we are. Maybe it's not about being good, but about being honest with the darkness we carry. If this moved you, unsettled you, or made you think, maybe some part of you needed to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you're searching for more than easy answers, and share your reflections in the comments. We're only just beginning to unravel the contradictions that make us human.